The Saraswati Civilization, a paradigm shift in ancient Indian history by G.D. Bakshi. Introduction. A lost river, a lost history. Assault on the Indian identity. Few countries in the world have had their sense of self so comprehensively attacked and destroyed by a foreign occupying power than India. For 600 years, it was ruled by invaders who came overland. The Persians, the Greeks, Sakas, Huns, Scythians, Pathans, the Mongols, the Central Asian Mughals, and then Nadir Shah. These land invasions saw the invaders who had initially come to just plunder and loot the wealth of a flourishing and fabulously rich civilization stay on to rule. In the bargain, they largely Indianized themselves and adopted the cultural moves of the native population in a bid to mitigate the foreignness of their rule and thus make themselves more acceptable to their vast subject populations. In fact, Akbar went out of the way to cultivate marital alliances with Hindu princes and was secular and tolerant in his outlook. He gave high positions to Hindu nobles and economic experts in his court. This secular liberal consensus, however, broke down in the times of Aurangzeb. His relentless persecution of the Hindus led to the widespread revolts by the Sikhs, Marathas, and the Ahoms. In just 100 years, these revolts had destroyed the Mughal Empire and reduced it to a mere fiefdom in Delhi. This unfortunately paved the way for another set of invaders, who now came from the sea flank: the Portuguese, the French, the Dutch, and the British. They all came by the sea in search of the fabulous and fabled wealth of India. Unlike the overland invaders, however, the British refused to settle down or Indianize themselves in any manner. The colonial Raj was structured upon the loot and suction of Indian resources. Some $45 trillion worth of wealth was sucked out of India to finance the Industrial Revolution of Great Britain. A once prosperous land was reduced to abject poverty and recurrent famines. The British rule had strong overtones of racial arrogance and superiority. They just refused to go native. They justified the foreignness of their rule by the concept of imperial justice. India, they claimed, was never a nation state. According to them, it was just a polyglot mixture of scabbling castes, creeds, religion, and languages, forever so much at war with itself that it needed foreign rule to enforce justice and order. This was the concept of imperial justice that was used to legitimize the imposition of foreign rule over India. The First War of Independence, or the Great Sepoy Mutiny as the British called it, was sparked off by British racial arrogance and exploitative rule. It came as a great shock to the British that diverse races, castes, and creeds of India had come together for such a widespread revolt against the foreign rule. The British were able to suppress this rebellion largely by playing the races of India against one another. They largely used the Sikhs, Punjabi Muslims, and hill tribes against the Purubiya Sipahis of the East India Company. They suppressed the revolt with extreme brutality, but it had left them badly shaken. At the end of it, they resolved that they would never let the diverse races and creeds of India ever come together again. Fault line analysis. Towards this end, they identified every fault line in Indian society and went out of the way to exploit and widen these differences to perpetuate the policy of divide and rule. One of the primary fault lines identified was that of caste. Through the instrument of district gazetteers and censuses, they went on to deeply entrench and widen the fault lines of caste. In fact, Sir John Risley held the first caste based census in India in 1872. He famously wrote, "As long as there is caste, there will be no India." A major thrust of this caste based divide was to hive away the scheduled castes, SC, and the scheduled tribes, ST, from their parent Hindu society. The tribals of the northeast were largely converted to Christianity, and those in central India were thoroughly isolated from mainstream Indian society. A deliberate attempt was made to foster separate and distinct sub-identities based on the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes narratives. Later, the British went on to exacerbate religious tensions between Hindus and Muslims to a point that it ended finally in the bloody partition of India. They did this by giving separate electorates to the Muslims, Sikhs, and the Christians, as also the SC and ST communities. The colonial attempt at fracturing the Indian society into squabbling and competing fragments went to surprising lengths and levels of exploitation. The attempt was to foster a plethora of sub-identities based on caste, creed, and ethnicity, and above all, prevent the emergence of a pan-Indian identity that went beyond these fault lines. The simple fact is that this balkanization project succeeded brilliantly, and the British were able to extend their rule over 2 centuries by these tactics of divide and rule. Usurping history. The British, however, went much further in this insidious colonial project aimed at controlling emotions, opinions, and attitudes and promoting an atmosphere of utter subjugation. To this end, they systematically destroyed the traditional Indian education system based on gurukuls and supplanted it with a colonial system crafted by Macaulay. Funding for Sanskrit studies was curtailed and English and vernacular languages were emphasized. This was designed to produce loyal and committed English-speaking clerks for the colonial dispensation. An across-the-board attempt was made to inject a congenital sense of inferiority in the natives, to paint everything indigenous as inferior and low down. Over 2 centuries, these concerted cultural assault took its toll and inflicted a deep sense of inferiority among educated Indians. This narrative of inferiority was deeply internalized by the victims of this cultural and psychological assault that was remarkable for its sophistication and the lengths to which it was prepared to go to facilitate British rule in India. This colonial attempt to craft a civilizational narrative went to very great lengths and was hugely successful. Indian culture and its arts and crafts were derided. The very idea of India was ridiculed. One of the most insidious attempts, however, was to write the history of colonial subjects in a manner that would mitigate the foreignness of British rule and justify this rule to the natives. Colonial historiography, therefore, had a deeply ingrained racial bias. It very deliberately crafted a series of narratives that would fortify the cardinal concept of British imperial justice.